About 4 years ago, give or take a few months, my health insurance provider mistakenly listed me as deceased in their system. It took 7 months to correct. During that same stretch, my landlord decided to sell the building I lived in. My car was totaled by someone who ran a red light, and the consulting contract I'd been living on quietly dissolved. Coincidences stack up until they start to feel like a pattern. My friend Declan moved in around that time. We'd known each other since we were 8 years old. Grew up on the same street in Cork before our families scattered in different directions. His situation was collapsing too. A bad business partnership that had drained most of his savings. We were two people who had both hit the same wall from different directions, so we did what made sense. Split the rent on a place outside Galway, bought cheap groceries, and spent too much time online at night. The house was a converted farmhouse with a detached stone cottage at the back of the property connected to nothing. No interior door to the main house. Its own entrance off the side yard. I'd been renting it out to a young couple, Nadia, 22, and her sister Petra, 19, who needed to get out of a family situation that had become genuinely dangerous. They paid nominal rent. In exchange, they helped with the shopping when my knee was bad and kept the shared spaces tidy. They had their own life back there. I mention them now because they become important. It was actually Nadia who started it. She'd been down a rabbit hole of videos about contact rituals and supernatural bargaining, and one evening, she came through the side door while Declan and I were sitting in the kitchen and told us we should watch some of them. We did. Most were not credible, but the subject caught something in us. The way it does when you're tired and things aren't working, and the ordinary channels have all been disappointing. We started simple. The pencil game. 2 pencils balanced crosswise on a paper divided into 4 squares. Yes and no written in opposite corners. We asked questions. The top pencil moved. Not dramatically. Not in a way that ruled out air currents or microscopic hand tremors, but consistently enough that Declan filmed part of it on his phone and sent it to a group chat. A few people responded asking how we'd done it. We told them we hadn't done anything. Encouraged and operating with the particular confidence that comes from strong cannabis and late hours, Declan and I decided to formalize things. We spent probably 2 hours working out what we considered a genuinely reasonable proposal. Our theory was that everyone who'd ever made a bad supernatural bargain had done so impulsively, without thinking through the terms. We would be different. We would be systematic. The offer was structured as an exchange of equal duration. I was 34. We proposed 40 years of comfortable financial stability and professional recognition while living, not celebrity, which seemed exhausting, just enough that my daughter and my nephew, both of whom I was helping support, would be taken care of regardless of what happened to me. In exchange, 40 years of service to whatever entity after death, terms to be negotiated at that point. Declan had grown up in a deeply religious household. As the evening progressed, he had been quietly stepping back, contributing less, observing more. By this point, he was sitting against the far wall with his arms folded and his expression closed. He wouldn't add his blood to it. I respected that and didn't push. I had a small cut on my palm from an earlier encounter with a box cutter opening a delivery. I pressed my thumb against it and left a clear print on the paper beside the written offer. I read the terms aloud. Nothing happened. No flicker in the lights. No drop in temperature. No response from the pencil at all. What happened instead was subtler and harder to dismiss. Declan and I both, at the same moment, turned around toward the hallway. Not because we heard anything, because we both felt that something was behind us. We turned together, the way two people do when they share a single involuntary impulse. The hallway was empty. The house was quiet. My daughter was asleep upstairs and had been for hours. Declan slept on the sofa. I fell asleep in the armchair beside the coffee table, where the paper with my thumbprint still sat. I woke up the next morning and went through my usual routine on autopilot. Kettle on, radio low, standing at the kitchen window. When I went to set my mug down, I stopped. There was a print on the coffee table. Not a full handprint. An impression, the kind left briefly by a slightly damp surface, already fading at the edges. It faced toward me, toward the chair where I'd slept. The fingers were pointed in my direction. I looked at it for a long time before I called Declan over. The shape was wrong. I don't mean smudged or partial. I mean structurally wrong. 3 elongated fingers and what appeared to be a thumb, but proportioned differently to any hand I'd seen. The nails, if that was what they were, had left faint pointed marks at each fingertip, not scratches in the wood, more like the residue of pressure applied briefly and precisely. I took several photographs. I held my hand over it. Too large. Declan's hand. Too large. My daughter's hand. Checked while she was eating breakfast without explaining why. Too small, and differently shaped besides. When Nadia and Petra came through the side door later that morning, I had them press their hands flat beside the impression before I said a word about it. Both too small, and both with 5 fingers, which the impression did not have. Then Nadia asked what we'd been doing until 4 in the morning. She and Petra had been kept awake for hours. Their assumption had been that we'd had people over, that there was a gathering with music in the main house. This would not have been unusual for us on other nights. But that night, we hadn't had a single drink, and the videos had been turned off after the pencil game. Declan and I had talked quietly for a while, and then fallen asleep. Nadia described constant rhythmic thumping, and what sounded like low music. Petra had thought there were at least 6 or 7 people moving around above them. My daughter, whose room was directly above the sitting room, had heard nothing. We noted it and let it sit. That evening, Declan and I watched more videos, going deeper into the subject than we had before. One video, produced by someone who seemed genuinely convinced of what they were saying, claimed that viewing this material was itself a form of participation, that attention was a kind of invitation. By the time we turned the screen off, the house had developed an atmosphere I can only describe as a building holding its breath. Every sound the structure made, the pipes, the old timbers, the wind against the single-pane windows, seemed to come from the wrong place or at the wrong interval. We put on something deliberately mundane, a nature documentary, and eventually fell asleep. The coffee table in the morning had 2 impressions on it. Same shape, same orientation, both pointing toward my chair. I had wiped the surface clean the night before. My daughter, who was 16 and had been peripherally aware that something strange was happening, came downstairs, looked at them for a moment, and said she thought I should look up the rake. She'd encountered it somewhere online. I wasn't familiar with it. When I read about it, the fit wasn't exact, but the pointed extremities and the implication of something crouching nearby watching a person sleep were uncomfortable enough that I put my phone down and made tea instead. That same day, Nadia told me the previous night had been worse than the first. Not because of noise from the main house, but because the lights in the cottage kept cycling on and off in a pattern that didn't correspond to any fault in the wiring. They'd had the wiring checked when they moved in, and something had been at their door. At the outer door first, the one facing the open field at the back of the property, and then at their bedroom door. A scratching sound, slow and irregular. I live near the edge of farmland, and foxes come through occasionally, so scratching at an outer door isn't inherently inexplicable. But Nadia didn't think it was a fox. She said it was too deliberate, too patient. Over the following week, things accumulated. Nadia and Petra stopped sleeping in the cottage and moved their bedding into the sitting room. So now 4 adults were sleeping in the ground floor of the main house, while my daughter slept normally in her room above. The bathroom became uncomfortable in a way that no one could fully articulate. The shower curtain would be pushed aside between uses. Both my daughter and Declan woke up one morning with thin parallel marks on their forearms, the kind a cat might leave. Except the cat, an antisocial tabby named Mossfield, would not allow anyone but me within arm's reach. Declan had a particular wariness of it, and it had made plain on multiple occasions that the feeling was mutual. One night we all heard scratching at the front door of the main house. Declan and I went outside. The field behind the cottage was making sounds, irregular rustling in the grass that moved in a direction inconsistent with the wind. We followed it along the perimeter of the main house and down toward the cottage. The cottage light was on. We hadn't left it on. Through the translucent plastic sheeting Nadia had taped over a gap in one of the windows, Declan saw a shadow, a head-shaped silhouette, moving slowly side to side. He tapped my arm and pointed without speaking. We came around to the cottage door. It was standing open. Declan positioned himself behind me. I called out that we were armed, which was true. I had a heavy torch and Declan had a walking stick, and that whoever was inside would be better off coming out on their own. Nothing answered. We went in. The main space was empty. At the far end was the bedroom Nadia used. No door. A heavy curtain hung across the frame. I reached for the curtain and pulled it back. Every light in the cottage went out simultaneously. Not a flicker. An instantaneous, complete darkness, with a sound like a switch thrown by a larger hand than normal switches require. Declan said, "What is it? What do you see?" Then he ran, out the door and into the yard. I followed 2 seconds later. Outside in the dark, he was standing in the middle of the yard with an expression I had not seen on his face before in 30 years of friendship. He told me, when he could speak, that as soon as the lights cut out, he had felt something push past him from behind. A shoulder, a head at the wrong height, moving fast. He had assumed it was me leaving ahead of him. He had called after what he thought was my retreating back. Then he'd realized I was still inside. We barricaded the cottage door and went back to the main house. The power was out there too. Nadia was standing in the kitchen with her phone torch on. When we checked the breaker box, which is in the utility room off the kitchen, the main switch had been thrown. Petra reached in and flipped it back, and everything came on without any fuss, as though the system had been functioning perfectly all along. Nadia and Petra eventually found a flat in Galway and moved out several months later. They still come for Sunday lunch occasionally. They will not stay past dark. Nadia's position, which she has stated calmly and consistently, is that the night of the pencil game, I let something through that has been here since, and that it's angry because it delivered something and received nothing in return. I have pointed out, each time, that I received nothing. She disagrees. She notes that within 2 months of that night, the insurance company corrected their error and resumed my coverage retroactively. Shortly after that, a piece I wrote for a small publication was picked up by a larger one, and I started getting regular commissions. Declan, the following spring, settled a long-running dispute over his former business and received enough to clear his debts and travel for most of a year. Things around the property have not fully returned to normal. Footprints appear in the mud along the cottage wall after rainy nights that I cannot account for. The attic hatch drops open on its own several times a year. I wake up occasionally with marks on my forearms that weren't there when I went to sleep. The cottage feels different from the rest of the property in a way that visitors sometimes comment on without being prompted. My position hasn't changed. 40 for 40. The terms were clearly stated. If something accepted the arrangement and has been making partial payments, it is welcome to produce the remainder at its convenience. I'm willing to be patient. I've already been patient for 4 years. Growing up in the early 1970s in the port city of Marseille, France, my Aunt Celine represented everything I imagined the wide, glamorous world beyond my small neighborhood could offer. She was my father's youngest sister, 14 years his junior and 16 years older than me. She worked as a cabin crew supervisor for a prestigious European airline and lived alone in a sunlit apartment in Paris, in one of those tall Haussmann buildings where the windows open onto iron balconies and the city hums below like a living thing. She was what the French call a femme rayonnante, a radiant woman. Tall and lean with copper-brown hair, she always wore pinned at the nape of her neck, pale gray eyes that caught like the way still water does, and a laugh that arrived before she did. She traveled constantly. Rome, Lisbon, Copenhagen, occasionally New York. She would come back from these trips carrying small wrapped gifts and enormous stories, and she had a gift for telling them that made even the most ordinary layover sound like an adventure from another century. I adored her without reservation. When I was a child, she would take me to the covered market on Saturday mornings and let me choose anything I wanted. She never spoke to me the way adults usually speak to children, with that slightly lowered register that signals they are simplifying themselves for your benefit. She talked to me the way she talked to everyone, directly and fully, as though my opinions genuinely interested her. I suppose they did. She asked questions and listened to the answers. She remembered what I had said the last time she visited. That quality of being truly remembered by someone is more precious than almost anything else a person can give a child, and she gave it freely. When I grew older, my parents began allowing me to take the train up to Paris alone to stay with her for a few days each summer. Her apartment was always full. Friends and colleagues from the airline would gather on weekend evenings, women in silk blouses and men in open collars, everyone drinking wine and playing records and talking about things I only half understood. Politics, films, the impossibility of finding a decent apartment in the 6th arrondissement. I would sit in the corner of her sitting room, feeling magnificently sophisticated, simply by being allowed to remain in the space. She would catch my eye across the room sometimes and wink, including me in something wordlessly. Then one January, the week after her 32nd birthday, she called in sick to work with what she described to my father over the phone as a bad headache and a stiff neck. She thought it was a winter virus. By the following evening, she had been admitted to hospital. By the morning after that, she was gone. A bacterial infection that had moved so quickly the doctors had no language for the speed of it, only apologies. What followed were the heaviest weeks of my childhood. My father was not a man who showed grief outwardly, or at least he never had been before. I had seen him sad, subdued, quiet in the way that men of his generation had learned to be when something hurt them. But I had never seen him cry. Not once. Not in all my years of watching him. The night before her funeral, I passed the bedroom where he was dressing and the door was slightly open, and I heard a sound I had no name for at first, a low broken sound that did not fit the man I knew. I stood in the corridor for a long moment and understood that the world contained depths of loss I had not yet had reason to explore. At the funeral home, Celine was dressed in her airline uniform, the dark navy jacket with its silver insignia. She looked like herself, which was the most disorienting thing of all. So many people came that the line extended out of the building and down the street in the February cold. All these people who had known her from routes and layovers and dinner parties and random encounters in airports. All of them standing in the gray morning in their good coats, waiting to say goodbye. Sunday lunches with my grandparents in Marseille were never quite the same weight after that. There was always a chair that contained her absence more loudly than any presence. Years passed. I grew up. I moved, changed jobs, changed cities. I traveled a great deal for work throughout my 30s and 40s. The kind of frequent flying that erodes any poetry the experience once held and replaces it with the weary functional familiarity. Long-haul flights across the Atlantic became a kind of necessary ordeal, hours to be managed rather than experienced. For years I managed them with the help of a sleeping pill and 2 glasses of whatever red wine the trolley offered. It worked, in the blunt pharmacological sense of the word. I would go under somewhere over the ocean and surface somewhere over a different continent, my mouth stale and my neck aching and my dreams, mercifully, nowhere I could reach. Then, not long ago, I decided to stop. It was not a dramatic decision. No single moment of reckoning. I simply turned 54 and looked at the habit and found it looked back at me like something that had outlived its usefulness. So on a long overnight flight from Paris to Montreal, for the first time in more years than I could accurately count, I took nothing. No pill, no wine beyond what I drank with dinner. I sat in my seat as the cabin lights dimmed and the hum of the engines settled into its long sustained note, and I tried simply to let sleep find me on its own. It took a long time. When I finally slept, the dreams came quickly and badly, as though they had been waiting. I was on the same flight. The aircraft was descending far too steeply, nose tilted at an angle that the body recognizes before the mind does as profoundly wrong. Oxygen masks had dropped from the overhead panels and were swinging in the pressurized air. The passengers around me were reaching for armrests and for each other. their voices rising in that particular register that exists at the boundary between fear and its abandonment. Through the small oval window, I could see the dark ocean rushing upward, enormous and indifferent. I was not screaming. I was very still, which is somehow more frightening in dreams than panic. That terrible clarity of stillness, when the body has moved past the point where noise seems useful. And then I became aware of someone moving calmly through the aisle toward me. She was walking with the particular unhurried composure of someone who has done this walk 10,000 times, who belongs in this narrow space between the rows of seats, who knows every panel and call button and emergency handle by feel. She was wearing the dark navy airline uniform, the silver insignia on the jacket. Her copper hair was pinned at the nape of her neck exactly as I always remembered it. She was walking toward me with a small, quiet smile on her face, the smile of someone approaching a person they are genuinely pleased to see. Her feet were bare. I noticed this, and then I did not think about it, because she had reached my row, and she sat down in the empty seat beside me, and she took my left hand in both of hers the way she used to when I was small, and she was showing me something in the market that she thought I should examine carefully. "It's going to be all right," she said. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm and slightly husky and entirely certain of itself. "It really is. It looks bad right now, I know. Sometimes it gets rough, but it always rights itself in the end." She paused. "How are you?" And I began to talk. I don't know exactly what I said or in what order. I told her about the cities I had lived in and the work I had done and the years that had accumulated. I told her about my children and showed her my phone, explaining what it was, telling her she would have loved it, that she would have taken extraordinary photographs with it on all her routes. I told her my father had died some years ago and that my mother was still living and still herself, still impossibly sharp, still making the same lamb stew every Sunday with the rosemary from her kitchen windowsill. I told her that the apartment she had loved in Paris had since been renovated beyond recognition, and that the market where we used to go on Saturday mornings was now a boutique hotel. I told her about the 2 marriages and what had come after them. I told her about the years of flying and the pill habit I had finally decided to put down. I talked and talked, the way you talk to someone you have not seen in a very long time and are afraid will disappear again before you can finish. And as I talked, I noticed the aircraft was leveling. The terrible angle had softened. The engine's sound had returned to its normal register. The masks were still, no longer swinging. The passengers around me had quietened, some of them with their eyes closed, some of them looking out the windows with expressions of ordinary boredom, the boredom of people who have forgotten, moments ago, that they were afraid. The dream ended just before the cabin lights came back up. I felt her hand on my shoulder, a brief warm pressure, and then I was awake. The captain's voice was coming through the speakers to announce our descent. 30 minutes to landing. I sat in my seat for a long time after waking, not reaching for my phone, not opening the shade. I was shaking in the particular way the body shakes after a dream that has done something to it, trembling not with cold, but with the effort of return. Eventually I called my mother. She answered on the second ring as she always does, with that immediate alertness that has never left her even in her 80s, as though she has been awake and waiting for exactly this call. I told her I had dreamed of Celine. I described the dream, and then, because it was nagging at me, I mentioned the detail that it seemed wrong even within the logic of the dream. She wasn't wearing shoes, I said. In the dream, in her uniform, her feet were bare. It seemed strange. There was a pause on the line, not a long pause, a pause of the kind that contains something being carefully gathered and set down. She was buried that way, my mother said, without shoes. I said nothing. It's the custom, my mother continued, her voice measured in the way it becomes when she is speaking of things that matter deeply to her family. From the village your father's family came from, in the old country, when a woman is laid to rest, she goes without shoes. We followed it for Celine. We followed it later for your grandmother. I hadn't known this. I had not known because I was a child at the funeral, and the lower half of the casket had been closed. as is typical at open casket services. I had seen her face, her uniform, her hands folded. I had never seen her feet. There was no way I could have known, consciously or in any retrievable memory, that she had been buried barefoot. I am not a religious person. I was not raised with strong beliefs, and I have not acquired any with age. I am more comfortable with uncertainty than with doctrine, and I have generally found the impulse to assign meaning to coincidence to be one of the mind's most endearing and least reliable habits. But I sat in that airplane seat with my phone pressed to my cheek and my mother's voice in my ear, and I felt something settle in me that I have no rational framework for and no particular desire to explain away. She came, not in the way that people say such things loosely, not as metaphor or as the kind of soft comfort we extend to the grieving. I mean that something arrived in that dream that knew something I did not know, something that had access to a detail of her burial that I had never been told, that sat in a closed half of a casket when I was 9 years old and had never, in all the decades since, found its way to me. That detail was not in my memory. It could not have been in my dream by accident or construction. It was brought. I locked myself in the airport bathroom for 10 minutes before I could walk to the luggage carousel without embarrassing myself. I stood at the sink and let it all come. All of it. 50 years of her absence distilled into a few minutes of completely private grief. And also, underneath the grief, something warmer and more sustaining than I had any right to expect. I have had a full life. Not an easy one, but full. I have known good work and uncertain work and the particular exhaustion of starting over more than once. I have lost people I loved and watched others recede into distance and difference. I have carried the ordinary accumulation of things that don't resolve, that simply become part of the weight you learn to walk with. But for a few minutes in a dream, somewhere over the dark Atlantic, I got to sit next to the woman who brought me gifts from cities I had never seen and talked to me like someone whose opinions mattered. I got to tell her about my life. I got to hear her voice say that it was going to be all right in a tone that made all right feel like something real rather than something said. I still think about it. I think about the bare feet and what they mean. The custom carried forward from a village that most of my family has never seen. The thread of it running through the generations to land in a half-closed casket in a church in Marseille, and then, 42 years later, in a dream at 35,000 feet. I think there are forms of love that do not require a body to persist, that find their way through whatever gap remains between one world and wherever the rest of it goes. Celine, if there is any version of you anywhere that can receive this, I want you to know. I still remember the market on Saturday mornings. I still remember the wink across the room. Come back whenever you like. I'll be here.